All right, we are finally ready to ask the big question, where the heck did the Renaissance come from? I ask the question in this way because if you've been following along, then you know that we've kind of been investigating this question from the long view as part of our story with Giorgio Vasari as our guide of how Italian art specifically, and particularly in Tuscany, particularly in Florence, took on the shape that it took during the what's called the Ducento or the 13th century and thereafter. And I have been suggesting that even though Vasari, you can find fault with him in places, even though you could criticize his sort of grand theory of the universe, nevertheless, he's fundamentally right. That's basically been my suggestion, that there is such a thing as decline in art, and there is such a thing as success and what he calls perfection in art, and that fundamentally the idea has to do with how convicted you are of the idea that the world is created with a divine order. And I've been detailing the ways in which that idea kind of came into the world and passed out of it. And we've basically now got all of the elements in place because, Vasari says rather interestingly that the Christian church actually sweeps away a lot of the old pagan art out of its zeal for establishing the true faith, right? For saying this is what actually is true about metaphysics, which is important for the salvation of souls. And therefore, unfortunately, we have to bid farewell to all these gods and goddesses and heroes and so forth. And so we got to kind of like shrug that off. And move and the Christian church, he says Vasari, in that zeal kind of throws the baby out with the bathwater. And a lot of other things have been going on at the same time. There's been decline already in the what becomes the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and then finally just the Western Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And so the decline is not solely down to the Christian church. It's also down to the Goths. It's also down just to general civilizational crack up, which leaves less and less sort of resources and ability and time for training new artists in the great tradition of the Greeks. And so this is all kind of now in place. We've established the Christian church. It has kind of taken a foothold in Italy. And we still have this kind of lingering question, well, all right, fine, but who, really makes the thing work? Let's say all the elements are in place. We're ready for a rebirth, a rinascita of this of this ancient idea of painting and sculpture that can capture the order and elegance and form in the universe. But that whole tradition has sort of been lost. So what happens? Well, this is where, according to Vasari, Cimabue bursts on the scene. And when we were talking about Apelles, we kind of touched on this notion that really great art contains within it the notion of the really genius individual with insight. And of course, there's the tradition, and there's the material elements, and there's the technique involved. But there's also always the necessity for a single human mind to see the world in a certain way and to convey that world with taste and conviction. And so this is, kind of what Cimabue, the role that Cimabue plays in Vasari's story. And we're going to get into just how much of what Vasari attributes to Cimabue is really Cimabue. But we're also going, I think, ultimately to land on the fact that if it wasn't Cimabue, it was somebody, right? Because there are paintings that clearly make a kind of quantum leap out of the Byzantine style and into what will become this new style of the Renaissance. So let's get into it, and we'll decide who we can give the crown to in a bit. So here's the opening of the life of Cimabue. And remember that, I've been reading to you mostly from the preface, and there are introductions to each part, but the whole thing is structured with these little biographical sketches, right? And so we begin with the life of Giovanni Cimabue. We will get soon into the meaning of that name, but here's Vasari's introduction to Cimabue. He says, by the infinite flood of evils which had laid prostrate and submerged poor Italy, there had not only been ruined everything that could truly claim the name of building, but there had been blotted out, and this was of graver import, the whole body of the craftsman, when, by the will of God, in the city of Florence, in the year 1240, there was born, to give the first light to the art of painting, Giovanni, surnamed Cimabue, of the family noble in those times of Cimabue. Now, this is a classic kind of Vasari passage. It's like everything was dead. There was nothing. It was blank. And this is, we've troubled this idea a little bit as we've talked, but the notion is, right, that this is the guy that kind of lights the spark, and something new is going to come into being. And that, I think, is really true. Something new is about to come into being. Chimabue is the one that kind of walks onto the scene. And he's born by the grace of God. There's no other way about it. There's nothing to say except that when the time was right, the man existed who could make use of the developments up to that point. And he, while growing up, being judged by his father and by others to have a beautiful and acute intelligence, was sent to the end that he might exercise himself in letters to a master in Santa Maria Novella, his relative, who was then teaching grammar to the novices of that convent. But Cimabue, in place of attending to his letters, would spend the whole day, as one who felt himself led thereto by nature, in drawing on books and other papers, men, horses, houses, and divers other things of fancy, to which natural inclination fortune was favorable, for certain Greek painters had been summoned to Florence by those who then governed the city, for nothing else but to restore the art of painting, which was rather out of mind than out of fashion. And they began, among the other works undertaken in the city, the chapel of the Giondi, whereof today the vaulting and the walls are little less than eaten away by time, as may be seen in Santa Maria Novella, beside the principal chapel, where it stands. Wherefore, Cimabue, having begun to take his first steps in this art which pleased him, playing truant often from school, would stand the livelong day, watching these masters at work, in a manner that, being judged by his father and by these painters, to be in such wise fitted for painting, that there could be hoped for him, applying himself to this profession in honorable success, to his own no small satisfaction, he was apprenticed by the said father to these men, whereupon, exercising himself without ceasing, in a short time, nature assisted him so greatly that he surpassed by a long way, both in drawing and in coloring, the manner of the masters who were teaching him. For they, giving no thought to making any advance, had made those works in that fashion wherein they are seen today, that is, not in the good ancient manner of the Greeks, but in that rude modern manner of those times. And because, although he imitated these Greeks, he added much perfection to the art, relieving it of a great part of their rude manner, he gave honor to his country with his name and with the works. Now, we're going to start to get into some of these individual specific works that Cimabue attributes. But the interesting thing here is that he says Vasari says the art was lost, but what was worse is that the tradition of craftsmen was lost. And so a crucial part of that spark is you get the right guy. You get Cimabue, who has this natural gift, this natural talent, and then he meets up with a tradition, such as it is. And it's kind of confusing because he says they painted not in the good ancient style of the Greeks, but in the rude modern manner, by which he does not mean the modern manner of the Renaissance, but by the maniera greca, the sort of Greek manner, the Byzantine style. And this style has been basically just stagnating. They've just been sort of doing the same thing for a while, over and over again. And they teach Cimabue that art, but Cimabue himself also makes these advances and these additions. And what's great about it is, we have seen that the sort of style of many great artists is to begin with what's going at the time, and then to kind of make changes and trouble it and make additions. And this is a sort of perennial fact about great works and great artists, that they kind of learn the sort of highest possible form that they can, and then they break it. I mean, this is like some of the poets that are kind of modernists initially write these very like conservative works and then kind of break out of it. Picasso is somebody that makes these classical works and then sort of moves into abstraction, or at least into a sort of weird new style. And this is why, I always have a certain suspicion when people say, oh yes, I'm a poet, and I write sort of free-form poetry, or like that girl who was the poet laureate or whatever, or who gave the inaugural poem at Biden's inauguration. Who poor girl is like just a kid, but not a poet. I mean, just terrible at what she does. And they say like yes, I'm in this sort of avant-garde style, and it's like, well, if you're in the avant-garde, have you really progressed beyond the guard, right? Have you really progressed beyond the sort of traditional forms? And the truly great innovators, right, have a very deep knowledge of the stuff that they're innovating from, because otherwise, how could you know which innovations are meaningful? Only if you're working within this tradition. So even as he says, Vasari, that all of this rude Greek manner was sort of to be surpassed, and it was stagnant, and all of that may be true, and yet Cimabue becomes Cimabue by studying that style and by working with it. And you can see this very clearly in many of the works of his that survive. And now we begin to get here into the matter of attribution, the difficult question of what was really painted by Cimabue. And it's going to become particularly important when we move into the great innovation of the Rucellai Madonna. But that's coming up in a bit. First, let me just make this sort of general asterisk that I'm going to kind of go with things that we are generally pretty certain were made by him. But there's always the possibility that somebody's going to come along and find some document that says, actually, this was painted by Duccio or something. And so I wanted to, show to you, if you're watching on YouTube, again, you can look and find the crucifix at Santa Croce, which I sort of read about some of Cimabue's work there in Vasari. And we can see these crucifixes that he made. This is probably one of the earliest things he made. And that's, Vasari mentions his work there pretty early on in his life. And it does pretty clearly reflect what you would think of as the Byzantine style, even as it has a lot of life in it, right? And I say this semi-ironically since it's a picture of Christ's death, right? But if you look at it, this notion of the figure kind of flattened onto a background, the background itself kind of luminous and glowing. You have even kind of the classic gold background to the right and left of his hands. That's, traditionally you depict Christ's death with Mary and John the evangelist, who's thought to be John the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this moment where Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son, man, behold your mother," right? This is supposed to be the kind of union of these two people in the death of Christ. And so the whole thing is very strikingly executed and has some of that kind of otherworldly arresting power of the Byzantine sort of gold mosaics and so forth, right? But also at the same time, you can see the motion in it, right? Christ's body is very sinuous, kind of elongated. The expression on his face is quite striking, quite powerful. Just the kind of anguish that he's going through on the cross. And these are images that are clearly for contemplation, right? That are Keats says of the Grecian urn in his Ode on a Grecian Urn, he says, "Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity." And that's kind of the vibe here, if you will. And so, you can see both what some of what Vasari is talking about, that this is a more sophisticated work and a more kind of uniquely individualized work than some of the Byzantine stuff. And yet, at the same time, it has real Byzantine, influence and power to it. And actually, I wanted to look at his last work as well. We looked just now, one of his early ones, the crucifix. Now let's look at his work in Pisa Cathedral. And it's a mosaic, which is sort of rare for the stuff that survives from him. We typically tend to look at paintings by Cimabue. But you can get a feel for his mastery, right, of the old style. This is Christ enthroned, again with John and Mary. And he's holding a book that says ego lux sum, and then it looks like it says moody, and this is a little tidbit that will be helpful to you if you're ever trying to decipher inscriptions and stuff in art. That you see there's what's called an overline or a vinculum on the U, so M-U-D-I. What it actually says is ego lux sum mundi, but there's an N missing because they had to squish it into this book in the art, right? And so this is sometimes what's called, when it gets done to famous names from the Bible, it's called a nomen sacrum, a sacred name, which gets compressed with this overline. In this case, it's just an abbreviation of the word mundi, of the world. But that's something to know if you ever see something, you have some Latin, but you can't understand what's being written on a painting or so forth. That's part of the way to unpack it. And then under him, at the hem of his robe, you have a line in Latin from Psalm 90 or 91, depending on the numberings you use. "You will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent." And so this is kind of Cimabue showing his mastery of the old forms. And again, with much greater detail, the folds of Christ's robe are pretty amazing. And that the sort of drapery and clothing is going to become really important as artists start to bring figures to life. And you can see his attention to those details in this incredible mosaic. But you can also, again, see that he was not just like messing with things, just because he had a contempt for tradition. He had an incredible grasp of tradition, but he was also starting to push at the edges of what the Byzantine style can do. And you can really see this in a Madonna. We're not going to get into the Rucellai Madonna. I'm going to get to that in a bit. But this is the Madonna enthroned with St. Francis, which again, we're pretty sure we can attribute to Cimabue, although there have been some questions raised. And you see, right, in comparison to some of those figures that face straight out at you from those Byzantine sculptures and that sit flat on the wall, right? You can see that this Madonna has a certain grace to her face. Her figure is sort of sloping, and the word that people start to use as the figures come out of the painting is sculptural, right? Instead of just floating in a kind of ambient gold array, she's sort of got some heft in space, and this sort of thing is going to become an important sort of technical aspect to the development of the Renaissance. But these are kind of, you might think of them as like pressing up against the boundaries of the Byzantine style, right? We want to do more here. We want to show more about the humanity of art, about the humanity of the Christian religion, right? We want to show more than the Byzantine style maybe necessarily allows us to do. And so this is why the Rucellai Madonna, which we are going to get into in a second, becomes such a crucial moment, because this is where, if you're pushing up against the boundaries and pushing and pushing and pushing, this is where somebody breaks through. And the question is, who? If I did not have Truebill, I suspect that I would still be subscribed to like FaceApp. These guys get me every time with, these subscription scams. They'll give you a week free or even like a year free or something. So then you totally forget that you downloaded this app to do one thing. Like, let's say you wanted to watch one show on Hulu. And you're like, yeah, I'll get the free trial. You totally forget about it. And then it rolls over and suddenly you're just shilling out all this money for stuff you're not using, which, can add up to a lot, which is why Truebill really helps. They go through all of your subscriptions and they help you find the ones that you do not want. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. You've got to go to that link, truebill.com/heretics. There's like all sorts of things that you probably are subscribed to that you don't know about. One guy reported that he saved $660 for the year on DirecTV, $120 for the year on Sirius XM, and $840 a year on car insurance. That stuff really does add up, especially in the world of inflation. So go right now to truebill.com/heretics and start canceling today. Truebill.com/heretics could save you thousands a year. So this is from Vasari's life, and it's a story of a painting that just absolutely overwhelmed the world, that just blew people out of the water. And it's attributed to, this is still from Cimabue's life, right? So he says, he made for the church of Santa Maria Novella the panel of Our Lady that is set on high between the chapel of the Rucellai and that of the Bardi di Vernia, which work was of greater size than any figure that had been made up to that time. And certain angels that are around it show that, although he still had the Greek manner, he was going on approaching in part to the line and method of the modern. Wherefore his work caused so great marvel to the people of that age, by reason of their not having been seen up to then anything better, that it was borne in most solemn procession from the house of Cimabue to the church, with much rejoicing and with trumpets, and he was thereby much rewarded and honored. It is said, and it may be read in certain records of old painters, that while Cimabue was painting the said panel in certain gardens, there passed through Florence King Charles the Elder of Anjou, and that among the many signs of welcome made to him by the men of this city, they brought him to see Cimabue's panel, whereupon, for the reason that it had not yet been seen by anyone, and in the showing it to the king, there flocked together to it all the men and all the women of Florence, with the utmost rejoicing and in the greatest crowd in the world. Wherefore, by reason of the joy that the neighbors had thereby, they called that place the Borgo Allegri, which place, although enclosed in time within the walls, has ever after retained the same name. So what is this painting? I mean, this he talks about it as if it's like, some sort of miracle drug that cures every disease or something. I mean, imagine like, carrying a painting on your shoulders through town and people weeping and following it with such delight, right? What could possibly, I'm not even sure I can imagine what form of development we could make now that we would do this with. But in Florence, right, this is supposed to be just like the the thing that brings people to absolute tears, brings monarchs, much as Alexander came to the studio of Apelles, King Charles is coming to see this Madonna. Let's look at the painting. So again, if you're watching on YouTube or you can look it up, here is the Rucellai Madonna. And we can definitely see what's happening here. He talked about the angels, and it's the angels that draw the attention, right? Because look at the bottom, at the way the feet of the angels and their knees, right, come out from in front of the throne, the way that their hands are kind of curling around the throne, and just the deliverance of this woman. It's as if they're bringing her out directly out of heaven into our lives. And this is the moment when Christian art kind of begins to take on the full character of what it can be, because you have this notion that the divine takes on flesh, right? And so this is kind of the theological consummation of this idea that, well, the world is made by God, there's a divine order to it. Painting can kind of illuminate that order, can bring it out. And now, what if we could actually recreate the forms of life, in realistic detail, and recovering some of those techniques, which again had been lost, right, from some of the Greek painters like Apelles. This is why this is such a bombshell. So I'm going to read to you a description of this painting that I think really gets it right, and notices something important, which is that the angels are not just decorative as they are in many of these other paintings. They're actually carrying the throne, which is just such a beautiful sense of space, right, and real time. But before I do that, we have to talk about whether this thing is actually by Cimabue, because for the longest time, Vasari was just taking his word. Yes, this was a great work by Cimabue, and this is why Cimabue is the originator of the Renaissance. And yet, in 1889, this Austrian art historian, Franz Wickhoff, writes an essay called, it's called Über die Zeit des Guido von Siena. You can only get it in German, but you can find it. It is online. You have to pay, I think I paid like $7 for it. And in this essay, he argues that actually the Rucellai Madonna is by Duccio. Now, Duccio is a Sienese artist. And one of the things that, may have held Vasari back from attributing this to Duccio could, if he had known, could have been his sort of insistence on this kind of Florentine supremacy, that Florence is the place where it all comes into being. But he may just simply not have known. He may have still been right. I want to kind of leave open, not myself being, I will never be the guy that can go and analyze the composition of the pigmentation and tell you, well, that actually this has to have been painted by Duccio. But I do want to just always take a certain note of skepticism, especially when we come up against these guys from the 19th century Germans, basically, who believe in art and literature as a kind of science, right? And because there are stylistic similarities, because the style of Duccio is clearly kind of echoed here in this Madonna, we must attribute it. The dating and the style insists that it's scientifically proven that this belongs to Duccio. I am not always so certain of this, in part because artists can work outside of their style, and that's part of the point of the story that Vasari is telling, right? All of that having been said, right, this has been attributed to Duccio basically universally. Wickhoff's attribution was agreed upon and picked up and remains to this day. And so this book that I'm going to read you, which is a really great book about the kind of period of the part of Vasari that we've been reading through together, takes this to be a painting by Duccio. Let's read what he has to say about it. This is Painting in the Age of Jotto by Hayden McGuinness. I believe it's out of print. I had to get a used copy. So you may, if you want to read it, you may have to get a used copy. But it's a really lovely book that helped me prepare for these episodes, so I would recommend it. But here it is. He says, Duccio depicted the Virgin and Child enthroned, surrounded by angels, and in the frame 30 medallions of saints and Old Testament figures venerated by the Laudesi. As intercessor, the Virgin looks directly into the world of men. The Christ child, more remote, bestows a general blessing. The great wooden throne is an intricate but airy structure, draped with a lavish textile and adorned with a large red cushion. It glitters with golden highlights, clearly reflections from the splendor of the principal figures. For right of the Virgin, these highlights fall on the left side of the throne's posts, while to the left they fall on the right, and the upper platform of the dais darkens in absence of the divine illumination. The image is a vision not of ascent, as some writers would have it, not even of a timeless paradise, but rather of a descending glory. The 6 angels seem to bear the Virgin's throne, complete with dais, toward us. An apparition settles in the world of the Laodicean. This conceit was so revolutionary that it required the invention of equally revolutionary forms. The kneeling poses of the angels, like the disposition of their wings, suggest a coming to rest. That the function of the angels is more than ceremonial we know from their grasp on the throne. In the lower left corner of the panel we see, below the side of the throne, the fingers of the angel's left hand. At the upper left, the fingers of the angel's left hand appear well below the knee. These motifs, extraordinary in their spatial implications, if anatomically suspect, clearly point to the angel's weight-bearing function. It was fundamental to this function that the angel should acquire indications of adequate corporeality, and Duccio surely evolved the figures from close observation of nature. For the angel's draperies move about the figures, stretching, falling loose, and circling and defining shape, all in accordance with the logic of unseen supporting form. At times, their diaphanous character evokes hidden anatomy. At other moments, the draperies serve as the metaphor of substance. This is a wonderfully written book, I have to say, and of a great study of the art of this period. And what I love about it is it gets across that this painting is the meeting of a radical innovation in form and in substance, in both the techniques that were being, that had to be invented to convey the truth, and the truth itself. This painter is saying something, right? He's saying that the God is not remote, right? That he's not up in some heaven where he can't be reached, but rather that heaven has condescended to carry physically in a body the Godhead down, right? And that's, Mary's task is to present that, and the angels support her. And in order to convey that adequately, in order to bring that viscerally to life for us, Duccio, or, if it was Cimabue, had to invent new ways of painting, which really were kind of, cracking open this whole door of what could now be done, how real the story of Jesus could now become in the painting of Europe and of the Renaissance. And so it is kind of amazing that, we've reattributed this painting. It kind of rewrites the whole history of art, right? I think that Cimabue still deserves basically his place of honor at the beginning because of some of the other paintings that we've looked at, right? Clearly pressing at the boundaries of art, at the boundaries of what the Byzantine style could do. And yet this painting is kind of where the penny drops, right? This is where everything clicks. And suddenly you see what's going to be possible. It's an explosive moment in the history of art, really incredible. And so it's kind of, sad for poor Cimabue that he's been robbed of this crown. But as a sort of a moment of art history, what's interesting is it really doesn't take us away from the wonder of the thing, because maybe it's a matter of great importance to Cimabue whether he was the one that painted this or not. It's a matter of great importance to Duccio whether it was him or not. But to us, right, it still remains the case that at some point, right, someone, be it Duccio or Cimabue, walked onto this scene, right, and made that one painting that changed the entire world. And so where did the Renaissance come from? Well, it came, ultimately it came from God, but it came from God in two directions, right? Both the development of history, which Marxists will tell you is everything, right? It's all just the material circumstances. And those do play a role, right? The development of history, the stability of European civilization, the grasp of the church upon culture, and the, all of these things that were laying the groundwork for somebody to make advances past the Byzantine style, and indeed the exhaustion of the Byzantine style itself. And yet, right, it also comes from God from the top, right? By the grace of God, there walked onto the scene a man who had a vision. That man apparently was Duccio, so Vasari gets that wrong, if indeed Wyckoff was right. But what he does not get wrong is the notion that God sent somebody into the world, right, to do this thing. And so this is kind of what I want to talk about now, is the transition away from, this kind of these original moments, these pressing up against the glass of the Renaissance, into the life of Giotto, who really, regardless of what we say about Duccio versus Cimabue, is going to be the guy that kind of really ushers us into the new age. And I want to get there by talking a little bit about Dante. I have to say I'm really impressed with how public goods stuff in my house has really endured. That we first started buying stuff as we were buying our house, and it was cool to kind of decorate. They have these great products that really look sleek, especially in the kitchen is one of the places that I find them like most appealing, because usually you go and you put these kind of gross kitchen soaps or whatever, this like bright blue stuff, but these guys have these very sleek, clean products that you can put on your kitchen counter, and they really match basically any decor. Plus, that they haven't got all this weird gunk in them. They're eco-friendly. They're cleanly made. You can get soaps, sponges, basics, all kinds of snacks, which I really love. Chad Cat loves the freeze-dried duck nibs. And it's all just stuff you can trust, which is not always the case when you go to the grocery store. You never know kind of what weird, gross stuff they're putting into your food or into your cleaning products. There's an incredible deal that Public Goods offers for Young Heretics listeners, and that is you get $15 off with no minimum purchase on your first order. So that's just $15 of free stuff when you go to publicgoods.com, publicgoods.com/heretics. You have to use that link, publicgoods.com/heretics, and use the code heretics at checkout to get $15 off your first order. So I kind of teased this a little bit, but I wanted to mention and describe the relationship between Dante and especially Jotto, with whom he was supposed to be good friends. But just his relationship to these artists in and of themselves, because he saw something about them, which is kind of expressed by the name Cimabue itself, because Cimabue means hard-headed, and it's perhaps a reference to the fact that this guy was like kind of a dick, or at least that he was very self-conscious and arrogant in his art. And this is something that, Dante recognizes in artists. He puts a lot of great artists in Canto 11, Book 11 of the Purgatorio. So, recognizing their greatness, even his friendship with some of them, but they are among the proud who have to carry the weight of their sins, literally, until they're purged from the earth, and then they can enter heaven. So let me just read to you. This is a speech. Dante, as he's traveling through the other worlds, reaches this guy Oderisi da Giubio, who was an illuminator. That is, he made the illuminated manuscripts that we now still sometimes see, and you can find a few of his works still are extant. They're very beautiful. You can see how the Byzantine style kind of informed this fanciful proliferation of figures around the margins of books which are becoming very important this time. Here's what Oderisi says to the Dante of the poem, the speaker, who encounters him among the... Now, I'm reading from Alan Mandelbaum's translation of the Divine Comedy, which is a really beautiful edition, Modern Library. And here is Oderisi. And Dante says to him, "Are you not Oderisi, glory of Giubio, glory of that art they call illumination now in Paris? Brother," he said, "the pages painted by the brush of Franco Bolognese smile more brightly. All the glory now is his." So immediately we have this notion, right, that the glory of man is transitory and that now somebody else has surpassed Oderisi in illumination. They smile more brightly. All the glory now is his, mine but apart. In truth, I would have been less gracious when I lived. So great was that desire for eminence which drove my heart. For such pride, here one pays the penalty. And I'd not be here yet, had it not been that while I still could sin, I turned to him. So he's saying, I wouldn't even be here if I hadn't asked God for mercy. But even so, right, my pride was so great that I wanted to be the best. I didn't just want art to progress. I wanted myself to be the guy who did it, right? And C.S. Lewis talks about this, that, at some point, a man who achieves true humility could love a work done by somebody else as much as a work done by himself. And this is kind of the effort that they have to make in purgatory to achieve that detachment from their own glory. "O empty glory of the powers of humans," says Oderisi, "how briefly green endures upon the peak, unless an age of dullness follows it. In painting, Cimabue thought he held the field, and now it's Giotto they acclaim. The former only keeps a shadowed fame. So did one Guido. From the other rests the glory of our tongue, and he perhaps is born who will chase both out of the nest. Worldly renown is nothing other than a breath of wind that blows now here, now there, and changes name when it has changed its course." This is an amazing and subtle and sophisticated passage. So let's start with the kind of perennial theme. This is from Homer. It's it's been around forever. The notion that the generations of men pass away like leaves. We get it in the Iliad, and we get it also in Milton, right? In later on in the English tradition, he'll kind of draw on this again with Lycidas, the poem in which he says, ambition is that last infirmity of noble mind. So this is a long-standing idea that kind of like, man's glory passes away unless a dark age follows it. So he's basically saying, like, if you're Apelles and then the world goes dark, then you get to be the guy whose glory endures and endures and endures. But if not, then somebody's going to surpass you. If the tradition is up and running, as it is now, right, in Dante's view, because look at how Cimabue began as kind of like the it guy, the one that, he thought he had it all, and then he was surpassed by this guy, Giotto. And what's so sly is that even as he's doing this, Dante suggests that maybe he's the guy, right, who's going to be the poet, and one is now born who may surpass all living poets. And so he's sort of, it's kind of self-deprecating to allow for his own pride, to sneak in some of his own pride as he's condemning all these other artists for pride. Right? He's saying this is basically our weakness. This is the weakness of artists. We're proud of ourselves, even though we should just be proud of what God is doing in the succession from artist to artist. So very sophisticated passage, and brings us on to this guy Giotto, whom we're going to touch upon now as we kind of bring this story not to a close exactly, but we're at least going to kind of wrap up some of the thoughts that we've been having by talking about Giotto and Vasari's story of him, because this is the idea, right? Whether it's Duccio or Cimabue, right? Somebody opens the door, and for Vasari, that's not the end; that's the beginning, right? That's the end of being stuck in the Byzantine ways, the maniera greca, and moving into the new ways, the modern style. But those angels in the Rucellai are so important, not only because of their own beauty, but because of all the possibility they represent. And it's just going to take centuries to work out that possibility, which means that Cimabue and Duccio alike are going to be surpassed, and it's Giotto who surpasses them. So let us read now the entrance of Giotto upon the scene, because Vasari has some interesting things to say about how all of that came to be as well. So here's the opening of Giotto's life. He says, that very obligation which the craftsmen of painting owe to nature, who serves continually as model to those who are ever wresting the good from her best and most beautiful features, and striving to counterfeit and to imitate her, should be owed, in my belief, to Giotto, painter of Florence, for the reason that, after the methods of good paintings and their outlines had lain buried for so many years under the ruins of their wars, he alone, although born among inept craftsmen, by the gift of God revived that art, which had come to a grievous pass, and brought it to such a form as could be called good. And truly it was a very great miracle that that age, gross and inept, should have had the strength to work in Giotto in a fashion so masterly that design, whereof the men of those times had little or no knowledge, was restored completely to life by means of him. And yet this great man was born at the village of Vespignano, in the district of Florence, 14 miles distant of that city, in the year 1276, from a father named Bondone, a tiller of the soil, and a simple fellow. So you have this kind of rude, raw talent, this just rustic boy born into the countryside, and yet even he, right? We've had some reawakening, but it's Giotto that's going to fully reawaken the art of painting and bring it to its highest excellence. And so we have this raw gift in him, this raw talent, and he explains. He says, Bondone gave some sheep into his charge, and he, going about the holding now in one part and now in another, to graze them, and impelled by a natural inclination to the art of design, was forever drawing, on stones on the ground or on sand, something from nature, or in truth anything that came into his fancy. Wherefore Cimabue, going one day on some business of his own from Florence to Vespignano, found Giotto, while his sheep were browsing, portraying a sheep from nature on a flat and polished slab, with a stone slightly pointed, without having learned any method of doing this from others, but only from nature, whence Cimabue, standing fast all in a marvel, asked him if he wished to go to live with him. And now this is the next step, right? Because Vasari always has to align raw talent to a tradition. And now he has a tradition that's really underway, right? Cimabue, whatever else you may say about him, whether he painted the Rucellai Madonna or not, right, was clearly working in the direction of the style that Giotto would really perfect, or at least would bring into being, because perfection would take many centuries, right? But this was going to be the completion of the rebirth of painting, and the story itself, the kind of discovery of Giotto in the middle of nowhere, right? Has the ring of anecdote. It seems to be taken from the commentaries of Ghiberti, Lorenzo Ghiberti, who wrote this kind of before Vasari wrote this anecdote, or rather this autobiography. But the relationship of training is true. It doesn't seem necessarily true that Cimabue was trained by the Byzantine painters, like Vasari says, but it does seem true that Cimabue trained Giotto. And so he recognized his talent, whether it was out in the field drawing sheep or not, and took him under his wing. And so now we get into another period of like, well, who painted what? And the earliest things attributed to Giotto, we really can't be sure of. This is in Assisi. So Assisi, another city of Tuscany, right? Famous for St. Francis. And in the chapel, right, there are these paintings of the life of Francis. There's one that looks particularly like Giotto, and that is St. Francis receiving the Stigmata. Vasari talks about this painting. It seems quite likely that he did it, although the date of his birth is somewhat up for grabs and up for questioning. So there have been questions. But if you read the Britannica entry on this, on Giotto's life, it gives a good argument that doesn't come right out and say he painted it, but sort of says, well, if he didn't paint it, you have to kind of invent some other painter who painted very much like Giotto, but nobody's ever heard of before, and where else did he come from? And there are other things that we do have from Giotto, and another Stigmata, Francis receiving the Stigmata, that looks very similar in design. And if you look at it, right, you can clearly tell that something new is going on here. But let's just mention those in passing as we move on to like hard Giotto core, you might say, right? If cottage core is like the essence of being, cute in a cottage, Giotto core is like, we know this is Giotto, and this really tells us about his style. And that is the Scrovegni Chapel, or also called the Arena. And this is in Padua. And this is where, patronage really starts to get going. Scrovegni is making basically amends for his usury, or perhaps his father's usury. And so he commissions these paintings, which is really a magnificent, series of frescoes. And at this point, we should mention, right, eventually in the Italian Renaissance, we're going to get onto oil painting, which comes into Venice from the Flemish masters, Jan van Eyck, and these guys are painting in oil, and this kind of makes its way into Italy. But at this point, we're dealing, Vasari says, with distemper. This is distemper, which is contrasted to tempera. Tempera is egg-based paint. But they both have in common, right, this thing that you can paint them onto wet plaster. You have to kind of work quickly. You use charcoal to kind of draw on what's called the cartoon onto the wet plaster. And then, you paint in sections as the plaster dries. And this does kind of lock in the paint. So we have some of these that survive. They've been, in many cases, darkened by candle smoke and kind of grimed up over the use of the church, because these were not just kind of things to sit in a museum. They were things to contemplate and be in the presence of and worship with. But they still exist, and we can still look at many of them. So we can look now, if you're on YouTube, at some of these really most famous works in the Scrovegni Chapel. And the one I wanted to particularly dwell on is the Lamentation. That's the death of Christ. And this is, if you've ever seen Giotto dealt with in an art history textbook, or even like a coffee table book, you've probably seen this painting because of how striking the motion is. And Vasari talks all the time about the emotion and the movement in Giotto's figures. And here we have the mourning of, St. John the Evangelist throwing his arms back, and Christ, lying dead, and Mary lamenting him. Both Marys, Mary, the Mother of God, and Mary Magdalene. Mary, the Mother of God, recognizable because in blue, right? And Mary Magdalene with her long hair, face, nose inches from Christ. The drama of it and the passion, the kind of wild emotional abandon. I mean, this is miles away from anything that we've looked at during this whole discussion. And you can see that the kind of seeds of it are contained in that Madonna and those angels, right? The notion that the angels could pop out, could live, right? Could break free of this kind of flat gold surface and become sculptural, become alive. Suddenly, just a world of possibility is open. And you can see in the passion of this that people are discovering through artistic technique, through new artistic technique, they're discovering endlessly generative possibilities in the scripture, right? It's the scripture that gives this to them. And it's the kind of conviction of God's order that has led them up to this point, but nobody could have predicted that this is what it would create. And it's, it is really only God, only a divine vision of the world that can make this technique possible. And it's only scripture that can infuse it with this kind of human and divine emotion, all blended in one. And if you've ever stopped short and just like stared at one of these things, you know how it can pierce you to the heart. And this is, this is the product of centuries. This is when I go on these rants about, we shouldn't just toss this stuff out because like it's white or it's bad or it's racist or whatever. It's like the arrogance and just the sheer, careless evil of saying that this stuff is somehow, an imposition of racism or Western chauvinism or colonialism, when it's plain, right, that it was the product of grinding sort of slavishly away in the service of an ideal, of a truth, right, which is not geographical, as Edmund Burke says, but which endures in all times and in all places. You can take anyone to this chapel. I don't care what his background is. I don't care what color his skin is. You can take anyone and look at this thing, and he will see that something new and of inestimable value to the human race has come into being. And this is the story, right, of how it comes to be. It starts with the conviction of divine order, and that conviction works itself out over centuries. It does not immediately transform, all human life. It takes people who live in time, gradual step-by-step motions through history, right, through the ravages of war, surviving over centuries of difficulty. The West finally works its way to the beginning of the Renaissance. And this is even just the proto-Renaissance. And we'll do more visual art, and we'll come back to some of the stuff that emerges in the wake of this. But what I wanted to talk about here was just how the whole spark got started. And you can see how it has a material, a technical aspect, and it has a spiritual aspect, which is indispensable. And the loss of that spiritual aspect is what we face when we look at our art today and we find it stagnant. So let's close by talking about that a little bit. Whenever I talk about Gold River Company, I feel like I am just evangelizing Americans into the ways of tea. And the ways of tea truly are blissful. It's an extremely civilized drink, especially if you actually don't love coffee, but you do want a kind of pick-me-up in your morning. Tea is just such a beautiful way to do that. There's all sorts of excellent flavors, and Gold River Trading Company makes great tea. It's not that easy in the States to get good tea. I have to say, in England, it's sort of like everybody's drink of choice, but around here, it's kind of more indie. It's more of a discovery. So when you go to goldriverco.com and use the promo code Heretics, that's Heretics, just like in the show, you can get 10% off everything. And they've got a bunch of different things, 6 different blends of excellent flavorful tea, 1 loose leaf tea, 1 hot cocoa. I really like their 1776 American breakfast blend. It's classic. But I'm also a green tea fan, especially in the afternoon. So gunpowder green tea is great. They have a chamomile variety if you're really not into caffeine. But everything that they make is pretty high quality and very enjoyable of a Sunday morning or afternoon. So go to goldriverco.com and use the promo code Heretics to get 10% off. That's Heretics, just for my listeners, 10% off at goldriverco.com. So Vasari goes on, and we won't have time today to kind of discuss it at further length, some of the wonderful details that Vasari gives us about Giotto, including spending a lot of time on his craftsmanship, on the paint, the specific kind of paint that he chose, and the way that he intended to, the way that he timed out his paintings, and he repeats a story, or sort of repurposes a story that comes from Pliny about him proving his excellence just by painting a circle, just by the purity of his line. He was able to demonstrate an audition for patrons, and this is the idea that that it takes that kind of painstaking craftsmanship used in the service of a higher vision of life. And so let me read to you now, because as I'm talking about this, I think it's obvious that that respect for craftsmanship is totally gone. This notion that you can just throw out all the rule books and art's just about what you feel, man. I heard this over and over again in elementary school, right? Just do what inspires you, and it's not better or worse. It's just your passion, right? And this stuff is it takes really hard work to actually give voice to a passion in art, right? It takes technical skill. And so Vasari actually talks in his preface, which we've dealt with before, about what happens after the death of art. So I wanted to read to you. He has these 3 ages, right? Art is reborn, and then it's sort of refined, and then it's perfected. But what happens next? And this is kind of touching to me to think about. Here's again from the preface. He says, "Thus far have I thought fit to discourse from the beginning of sculpture and of painting, and peradventure at greater length than was necessary in this place, which I have done indeed, not so much carried away by my affection for art, as urged by the common benefit and advantage of our craftsmen. For having seen in what way she, from a small beginning, climbed to the greatest height, that is, how art climbed to the greatest height from a small beginning, and how from a state so noble she fell into utter ruin, and that, in consequence, the nature of this art is similar to that of the others, which, like human bodies, have their birth, their growth, their growing old, and their death, they will now be able to recognize more easily the progress of her second birth, and of that very perfection, whereto she has risen again in our times. And I hope, moreover, that if ever, which God forbid, it should happen at any time, through the negligence of men, or through the malice of time, or finally through the decree of heaven, which appears to be unwilling that the things of this earth should exist for long in one form, that she falls again into the same chaos of ruin, that these my labors, whatsoever they may be worth, if indeed they may be worthy of a happier fortune, both through what has been already said, and through what remains to say, may be able to keep her alive, or at least to encourage the most exalted minds to provide them with better assistance, so much so that, what with my goodwill and the works of these masters, she may abound in those aids and adornment, wherein, if I may freely speak the truth, she has been wanting up to the present day." The reason I find this so touching is it's an incredibly tragic and realist view of life. Heaven never allows things to endure too long in one state. We've seen the birth and death and the decline of art in antiquity. We know that these things, all good things, like evil things, pass away. The things of heaven and earth all eventually shall pass away in time, right? And this is at least in this side of divinity, right? In this plane, this is just a fundamental truism, and it's like it doesn't have to be this way. Like we should be able to just keep getting better and better, but decline does occur. And what I love about Vasari is the foresight he has to say, this too may pass. We are now looking at the rebirth of something that was long dormant and has now come back, and it's a great joy to us. But it may be that one day this too shall pass away. And if so, I hope that what I am saying will be of worth, right, to people in the days past the decline. And what's so moving about that is that's us, right? He's writing to us. Like this is something that we miss sometimes when we read these old texts. We think, well, yes, it's of a great historical interest, but like these guys were not imagining themselves as just to be kind of preserved in amber. They were talking to us, to the future generations, and there's no question, that we are living in a time of some decline when it comes to the visual arts and even to movies, as I discussed before. This endless rehashing of old material, just the digging up of dregs from like the Star Wars barrel and the Star Trek barrel and the Marvel movie barrel, and just this kind of old recycling. It's obvious that we're at a point of kind of exhaustion with some of our old forms that were once great. And what I love about that is like it's not the end of the world. It's not something that like nobody ever thought would happen. It's actually part of the cycle. It's part of the process. And it means that another rebirth is possible. I really think that if you look at some of the stuff that people do in video games, and I know I've said this before, but like play a Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy 15, and look at the visual art that people are making. That is an artist that believes the world has something of structure and grace and value to offer to the viewer. And yes, video games can, get people addicted, and they can have negative consequences too. But you know what? Like Plato tells us, just because something's art doesn't mean it's good, right? There can be excesses of anything. But at least in digital media, there is an inkling, right? That people don't just want to like tape bananas to walls and put urinals into museums and splatter paint all over the floor. They're actually trying to recapture a sense of the divine order in things. And this, like anything else, it will be slow in birth, right? And there will be fits and starts, and there might even be, as there was after the Proto-Renaissance, a sort of regression and then a return to the kind of new ways. All of this is part of the story. We're still living in Vasari's story, just as we are still living out the story of the West. This is not the first time that we have faced decline. It won't be the last. Our job is to press forward as much as we can into the good, the true, and the beautiful, which endure in the order of the world, because God did, in fact, create it. And he did, in fact, make us to reflect his glory back at him. How's that for a Renaissance message? Let's do the mailbag. So I recently had an experience that made me extremely glad that I have my Theragun. I was at the gym, as I often am, and I just felt something like kind of tweak in my back. And you don't want to mess with your back. This was not like a spinal thing, I could tell, but it just felt like I was putting a lot of pressure on there. I wanted to be able to keep doing deadlifts. I did not want to be out with an injury forever and ever. So I just, thought this is a perfect opportunity for Theragun, because when you get that muscle tension that just really kind of knocks you out, Theragun can really help. Sometimes you got to go to the doctor, but Theragun is like a great option for all sorts of tension that you get at the gym, that you get just wandering around. I mean, we're all holding so much tension without even knowing it, especially if we sit at a desk all day. But also, if people with manual labor can really use this too. It is a handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension using a scientifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power. Plus, it's really quiet. And if you're a Young Heretics listener, you can try Theragun for 30 days, starting at only $199, which is a great deal. Go to therabody.com/heretics to get your Gen 4 Theragun today. That's therabody.com/heretics, just for my listeners, therabody.com/heretics to try it out. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, which is where VIPs can get exclusive content and additional stuff that I do, kind of riffing off of some of the ideas in the show. It's a really great community of fellow travelers who love to just take these ideas deeper and to apply them in life. So a lot of the stuff we talk about as well, I'm facing this situation. What would it look like to live out the vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful in this situation, or to follow Solzhenitsyn's advice in this situation? So it's really great. We do live stream Q&As. We would love to have you join us. It's youngheretics.com/locals, and you can be in the mailbag. So here's a question from the Huns, who is famous for dragging me. He does a lot of, he makes fun of me a lot during our live streams, which is fine. I accept it. But here he says, we've had many discussions over the past few months about people detaching from reality. In the recent episode about crossing the Rubicon, you stated Julius Caesar had opportunity to thrive in the country. To what extent is the detachment today a lack of frontiers? Do you believe achieving feasible space exploration will solve this problem? In part, yes. And I did mention this, I think, back in the Tiberius Gracchus episode, way back in the day, that the need for something like a new Homestead Act, right? The Homestead Act, which kind of encouraged the settlement of the frontier, is really pressing. And we've been talking about this in the American Mind for some time, actually. It's just that this, the kind of sense that everything has already been exhausted, this need that people feel to like retreat back into these smaller and smaller urban spaces, take up less and less space. That's a sense of decay. Even if we have environmental challenges to face, there's something spiritually deadening about the narrative that what we just need to do is pull back and shrink and resist plowing forth into any new space. I'm really against this thing that's like, well, we already have a planet here. Why should we go exploring new planets? I absolutely think we need to be going to space. We also need, I think, to be, looking at the use we can make of our country right now, which is so underused. And not in the sense that I want like a coal plant on every corner. But I do think, like you've seen with the Ukraine situation, that we have all of these, incredible minerals, these incredible resources, nuclear power that could be harnessed, and oil that we could be harnessing to resolve the issue for the world, even. I mean, not just for us, right? To help alleviate some of the pressure on the world that has come up as a result of the Ukraine thing. I mean, there's so much that we're being held back from by the EPA, by our sort of bureaucracy, that I think that would unleash a lot of energy too, and that would make the real embodied world a fun place to be in again. But I do think that space travel is part of it. I think it all has to be dictated by a sense of what we are, and that's where I know I keep harping on God. I know I keep harping on the metaphysics of it all, but it's like if you don't got a good philosophy, if you don't got a good theology, you're never going to do anything good with the places that you go. You can take your soul anywhere and it'll still be your soul. So you need to understand, right, that you are created in the image of God, that you're a rational animal, that your job is to give order to the world and to establish in each new age and each new place a vision of the heavenly kingdom. Like, this is an incredible mantle for us to take up if we'll do it. But we have to believe in such a thing as creation first. So yes, space travel, yes to more extraction of of energy from our own country and from the earth. Yes to using the tech that we already have in more edifying ways. But before all of it, right? Who are we and who is God is the question that we must answer. So yes, I think you're on the right track. But I do think that there's always going to be a God-shaped hole in anything we do until we resolve that issue. All right. That's it for me this week. I hope you have enjoyed this little venture into visual art. We will do more of it. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. And you can find them both online, and you can subscribe to get the Claremont Review of Books in your mailbox too. Donate to support us at claremont.org/donate. And here at Young Heretics, we would love it if you would subscribe to the YouTube channel, especially for these art episodes. If you would subscribe to the podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, and just share it. Tell people about it. It really, really helps. It makes a big difference. It makes my heart happy. But when you give us a 5-star review, that bumps us up in the algorithm so more people can discover it. I love hearing when people are like, I'm so glad I found your podcast. And that comes from you. That's from you guys. So please do help out with that if you can. And whatever else, I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.